The world runs on energy, but let's talk about the energy that runs you. For humans, energy comes from the food we eat. Our bodies need it to perform daily functions like brain activity, breathing, and keeping our hearts beating. Without it, we can't survive, even if we sit around and do nothing all day. But how do we harvest the energy stored in the nutrients that we get from food? The process behind this is called cellular respiration, which you probably learned about in 8th grade science class. This process captures energy in the form of an unstable molecule called ATP, which is immediately used to power the body. And if you're older than the age of 12, you probably know that in order to perform physical activity, our bodies need even more energy than usual. More food equals more cellular respiration equals more ATP equals more capacity for activity. So our bodies use cellular respiration to power exercise, right? In most cases, yes. But what if I also told you that not all exercise is the same, and that cellular respiration is like a slow charging power station? It's great for a long jog, but too slow to fuel max effort sprints. And because ATP is so unstable, our bodies can't just hoard it for later. Well, if that's the case, then what powers max effort exercise? It turns out that the body is able to store the energy that ATP carries in the form of a stable molecule called creatine. This high energy form is called phosphocreatine, and our bodies can instantly reconvert it back into ATP. This ATP phosphocreatine system is the hidden energy system behind every heavy lift and max effort jump, because almost no one knows about it. So today, I'll be going over the foundations of cellular respiration, ATP, and the ATP phosphocreatine system, and how they power exercise. This is episode 3 of my exercise physiology series where I explain the body's adaptations and responses to exercise on a very basic level. So in the previous video, we covered metabolism, calories, and VO2 max, and briefly touched upon cellular respiration as well. So now we're kind of picking up where we left off and continuing to focus on the broad scope of energy. So like I said in my previous video, cellular respiration is the actual metabolic process where nutrients are converted into energy. So it's catabolic because nutrients are broken down and kinetic energy is released. And it's the pinnacle of metabolism because without it, all the food you eat is meaningless and won't give you energy. Basically, nutrients with or without oxygen get broken down into waste products and kinetic energy, some of which is lost as heat. Think about it like income taxes. A portion of your income is always lost. And what does with or without oxygen mean? I'll explain it right now. There are two types of cellular respiration, aerobic and anaerobic. Aerobic respiration is the complete version of cellular respiration and starts off in the cytoplasm and finishes in the mitochondria. But the problem with aerobic respiration is that it needs oxygen, which sometimes isn't adequately available. Luckily, your cells can choose to halt the process before it reaches the mitochondria and requires oxygen. Now, this incomplete version is known as anaerobic respiration and is faster, but only produces a fraction of the energy along with many waste products. Luckily, oxygen is usually available, and so your cells are able to fully complete aerobic respiration most of the time, which is why the mitochondria is known as the powerhouse of the cell. I'll definitely explain more on anaerobic and aerobic respiration later in the video, by the way. So cellular respiration harvests chemical energy stored in the nutrients by breaking them down into kinetic energy in the cytoplasm and mitochondria. But so many other organelles across various cells need that energy to perform important functions such as muscle contraction, nerve signaling, DNA synthesis, cell structure maintenance, you name it. And the problem with raw kinetic energy is that it can't be easily transported and allocated at will because it's literally pure motion. So it needs to be stored in another chemical potential form so it can be transported. This is where ATP comes in. ATP, which stands for adenosine triphosphate, is an unstable molecule that has lots of chemical energy, and it can be easily transported within the cell, which is why it's so important. It's basically the temporary middleman between the kinetic energy released by cellular respiration and the kinetic energy of you moving your muscles, for example. If you're interested in the chemistry, it's made up of an adenine group, a ribose sugar group, and 3 phosphate groups, which is how it gets its name, adenosine triphosphate. The phosphate groups are actually negatively charged and there's 3 of them, so they're actively repelling each other. But they're also being forced together by their bonds. This is what gives ATP its high chemical potential energy. Think about it like a compressed spring. Once the bonds are broken, the kinetic energy is released in the form of the phosphate groups darting away from each other. And so because the 3 phosphate groups are actively repelling each other, they're highly unstable and their bonds are easily broken. This means that cells can break these bonds without having to input much energy, but ATP also breaks down rapidly, rendering them local and temporary. So the same property of negative charges that gives ATP its high chemical potential energy is also what makes it highly unstable and nuanced. So how does the kinetic energy released by cellular respiration get stored as ATP? This has to do with the creation of ATP, so let's talk about that. ATP synthesis is the building up of ATP molecules using adenosine diphosphate, aka ADP, which is basically just ATP but only with 2 phosphate groups, as the Latin prefix di suggests, and an inorganic phosphate group is added to that. So during this reaction, these 2 molecules are bonded together, which forms ATP, and that terminal bond is one of the high energy bonds between the phosphate groups I talked about earlier. Because of this, ATP synthesis costs energy in order to form that bond, and so this reaction is paired with cellular respiration, which provides the energy. This is known as a coupled reaction. Cellular respiration is catabolic and releases kinetic energy, and ATP synthesis is anabolic and requires energy. So basically, the kinetic energy released by cellular respiration is captured and used to form the bond between ADP and the inorganic phosphate group, which joins together as ATP. In a nutshell, all the kinetic energy released by cellular respiration transfers to the chemical energy in that terminal bond of the ATP molecule. So then afterwards, ATP is shuttled around the cell and transported to whichever organelle needs it, and then it's catabolized, aka broken down, to release that kinetic energy once again. ATP breakdown is the reverse reaction of ATP synthesis. Pretty much what happens is that the terminal bond is broken and the energy that the bond carries is released and powers the organelles carrying out activities such as muscle contraction. And the resulting molecules of ATP's terminal bond being broken are ADP and the inorganic phosphate group, which are the same molecules used to make it in the first place. So to summarize everything I just said, basically you got cellular respiration, which is the process cells use to break down nutrients into kinetic energy, and this occurs in the cytoplasm and mitochondria. But the problem is that some other areas of the cell need that energy, and kinetic energy isn't easily transportable. So the cells resort to using that kinetic energy to form ATP, a high energy molecule which they can transport around to places that need that energy, and then they break it down, releasing that kinetic energy once again and powering other reactions. Now we know the goal of cellular respiration is not only to harvest energy, but also to pack that energy into ATP where it can then be easily transported. Now let's talk about cellular respiration and exercise. Like I said earlier, your body tries to rely on aerobic respiration as much as possible because it's the complete version. And so it generates much more ATP per nutrient compared to anaerobic respiration, which is the incomplete version. But the full version has the limiting factor of oxygen because cells need it to complete aerobic respiration. But during exercise, energy demands increase with effort. This means that our bodies need to provide the cells with more oxygen so that cellular respiration can fulfill those increased energy demands. The problem is that there are limits on how much oxygen the cells can extract from the blood and the rate at which the heart pumps blood around the body, which I talked about in my previous video. So there's a limit on the rate at which cells can use oxygen, which is known as VO2 max, which I also talked about in my previous video. At a certain intensity of exercise, your body will reach its VO2 max, and that's the maximum amount of exercise that aerobic metabolism can support. I explained a lot about VO2 max in my previous video, including all these concepts, so I highly recommend you watch. So once your body reaches that high effort exercise that surpasses VO2 max, cells aren't able to get enough oxygen to complete the full process of cellular respiration anymore, and they have to scramble more to output ATP as fast as possible without oxygen, aka anaerobic respiration, the incomplete version. Scientists deem this type of exercise as anaerobic exercise, whereas lighter intensity exercise below VO2 max is known as aerobic exercise. If you're into fitness, you might be familiar with them. Some classic examples of anaerobic exercise are running fast and lifting heavy weights, while some classic examples of aerobic exercise are jogging and lifting light weights. It's all about intensity. But there are also problems with anaerobic respiration. Because it generates much less ATP per nutrient, it burns more fuel for the same amount of work done. Work is force times distance, by the way. This is why running fast burns disproportionately more calories than running slow, by the way, for the same amount of distance. And it also produces a waste product called lactic acid faster than our bodies can clear, so our bodies can't sustain anaerobic exercise for long. By the way, this lactic acid rapidly breaks down into lactate and hydrogen ions, which is what causes that burning sensation in your legs after a hard run. But guess what? our bodies also need to use oxygen to clear lactate. This creates an oxygen debt after anaerobic exercise, which is known as excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, aka EPOC, which is why you're left gasping for air after a hard run workout. But your body doesn't rely on anaerobic respiration only after VO2 max is surpassed. In my last video, I also talked about oxygen deficit at the start of all exercise. Basically, our bodies are really bad at increasing oxygen uptake fast enough to match the increasing energy demand. So it widely relies on anaerobic respiration in the beginning of all exercise, aerobic included. So you still have some EPOC even after aerobic exercise. This is why you also breathe kind of heavy after a light jog. So now we know the ups and downs of aerobic and anaerobic respiration and which fuels what type of exercise. Your body relies on aerobic respiration to fuel long jogs and anaerobic respiration to fuel faster runs. But what about sprinting as fast as you can? It turns out that while anaerobic respiration is pretty fast, it's still a multi-step reaction and can't match the super fast and high energy demands of maximum effort exercise. This is where the molecule called phosphocreatine comes in. Phosphocreatine is great because, as I hinted in the intro, it's a high energy molecule that's stable and can be held onto, unlike ATP. There's two components to this molecule, a creatine molecule bonded to a phosphate group. And just like with ATP, the creatine molecule has negatively charged regions and the phosphate group is also negatively charged. This means that they're actively repelling each other, but the bond holds them together, and so there's chemical potential energy in that bond, just like with ATP. But what makes phosphocreatine stable? I try to do lots of research on this, but it involves resonance structures and a lot of in-depth chemistry, so I'm not too sure myself. But the point is that unlike with ATP, cells can store phosphocreatine, like forever basically. But while it can be stored forever, only a small amount of it can be stored in each cell because it's still a high energy molecule that would cause imbalances in large quantities. So to build up phosphocreatine stores, after cellular respiration happens, your cells transfer the terminal phosphate group of ATP onto the creatine molecule, resulting in phosphocreatine and ADP. This reaction is called phosphocreatine synthesis, and it's also a paired reaction, as breaking the terminal bond of ATP releases energy, which is used to form the bond between creatine and the phosphate group. But what's the point of storing phosphocreatine in the first place? It's because unlike cellular respiration, which has multiple steps and takes time, phosphocreatine can be instantly reconverted to ATP whenever needed. Basically, the reverse reaction of phosphocreatine synthesis. The phosphate group is separated from the creatine molecule and attached back onto ADP, and this happens instantly. So this ATP phosphocreatine system is what enables us to exercise at max effort despite the limitations of cellular respiration by storing energy and instantly reconverting it back into ATP when it's needed. This is why phosphocreatine is so important, because back then when predators hunted our ancestors, for example, they couldn't afford to just jog away or even run somewhat fast to escape. They had to sprint away as fast as they could, and this ATP phosphocreatine system is what enabled that. Now let's talk about a few more concepts regarding the ATP phosphocreatine system and exercise. Because phosphocreatine is mainly used in max effort exercise, it's primarily utilized by muscle cells. And like I said earlier, cells can only store a finite amount of phosphocreatine. This is why you can't just sprint at 100% speed for an hour or rep your 1 rep max at the gym 10 times. So usually phosphocreatine stores deplete after like 15 seconds of max effort exercise. And you might be wondering why you still breathe heavy after you max out your bench press, because technically you're not using anaerobic respiration even, right? And yes, that's correct. But because phosphocreatine is depleted, your muscles need to replenish them. So even after you max out your bench, your cells undergo more cellular respiration to generate ATP to replenish these stores for the next time you want to max out. This is also another important contributor to EPOC. And remember the oxygen deficit at the beginning of exercise I talked about earlier. Turns out your cells actually turn to phosphocreatine before even using anaerobic respiration, because the ATP phosphocreatine system is the only energy system that can respond quickly enough to the sudden increase in energy demands at the onset of any exercise. So it's not only the system behind max effort exercise, but it's also the first responder to any form of exercise. So now let's put all the energy systems we learned together. Usually the timeline for aerobic exercise goes like this. At the start of exercise, your ATP phosphocreatine system is able to respond fast enough, so your cells mostly rely on that. But after around 15 seconds, your phosphocreatine stores deplete and your cells mostly rely on anaerobic respiration, while aerobic metabolism gradually warms up. But about a minute in, oxygen uptake fully catches up to meet energy demands, and so your cells are able to comfortably rely primarily on aerobic respiration. And then after exercise, your body breathes heavy to replenish phosphocreatine stores and clear lactate. So that's pretty much all I got for today. Basically, that's how cellular respiration, ATP, and the ATP phosphocreatine system work together to fuel exercise. And I think I'll make my next video solely about cellular respiration because it's such a vast concept and we only touched the surface today. And then I'll probably make my next video after that about creatine because I feel like it's so important and it's such a misunderstood product in the fitness industry. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video and learned a lot. And if you have a question or any comment you'd like to share, feel free to leave it down below. And once again, I also left some helpful resources that I think will be helpful for understanding this kind of stuff in the description. So yeah, peace out.